They mocked the old welder until the mercenaries attacked. They didn't know he was an elite deep-sea diver. Now, he's not just fixing pipes. He's turning the whole rig into a death trap. The Aegir 9 deep-sea mining station groaned. It was a constant, low-frequency moan of titanium struggling against 5,000 pounds per square inch of crushing black water. To the 20-something tech graduates running the control consoles, it was just background noise. To Elias Miller, it was the station's heartbeat. And today, the rhythm was off. Miller dragged his left leg as he walked the graded catwalk of Sector 4. It was a stiff, mechanical gait, the permanent receipt for a case of the bends he'd taken 20 years ago in the North Sea. He wore grease-stained coveralls that smelled of ozone and stale tobacco, a stark contrast to the pristine white synthetic uniforms of the junior engineers. He carried a heavy canvas toolbag that clanked with every step, a dinosaur in a digital world. "Yo, Barnacle!" A voice echoed from the upper railing. It was reckless laughter followed by a thud as an empty soda can bounced off Miller's hard hat. Miller didn't flinch. He just kept walking. He knew it was Caden, the lead geological surveyor. Caden was 24, brilliant at reading sonar maps, and completely useless with a wrench. "Check the pressure gauge, old man. Try not to fall asleep standing up this time," Caden shouted, high-fiving his friend, Tyler. Miller stopped at the junction box. He pulled out a rag and wiped a smudge of hydraulic fluid from the glass gauge. He wasn't looking at the needle. He was listening to the hiss of the bypass valve. It was vibrating at a frequency that suggested a hairline fracture in the ceramic seal. He'd told management about it 3 times. They'd filed his reports in the trash. To them, he was just the welder, a necessary evil to fix toilets and railing guards. They didn't know about his past. They didn't know that the shaking in his hands vanished the second he struck an arc. They didn't know that Miller had spent more time at the bottom of the ocean than most of them had spent in school. He was a sat diver elite, hardened, and clinically immune to panic. He tightened a bolt with a fluid, powerful motion, ignoring the insults raining down from above. He wasn't bothered by their disrespect. He was bothered by the sound of the ocean waiting outside. It sounded hungry. And in about 10 minutes, he'd find out exactly how hungry it was. The alarm didn't sound like a siren. It sounded like the world tearing in half. It started with a dull thump against the outer hull of the docking bay, a sound Miller instantly recognized. It wasn't the rhythmic shifting of the tectonic plates or the groaned settling of the station's legs. It was the distinct metallic clamp of a magnetic grappling docking collar. An unauthorized sub had just latched onto the Aegir 9. Before Miller could even turn his head, the main airlock doors blasted inward. It wasn't a water breach, it was a shaped C4 charge. Smoke filled the corridor instantly, thick and acrid. The shockwave knocked Caden and Tyler off their feet, sending their tablets skittering across the metal grating. Through the smoke they came. 6 of them. They moved with the precision of a drill team, clad in matte black tactical dry suits, their faces obscured by rebreather masks. They weren't pirates. Pirates were messy. These were pros. Mercenaries. They carried suppressed carbines and moved in a flowing formation that swept the room in seconds. "Down. Everybody on the ground now," the lead mercenary barked, his voice distorted by an amplifier. The young crew froze. Panic, raw and ugly, seized them. Caden was hyperventilating, clutching his chest, his eyes wide with the terror of a child realizing monsters are real. Tyler tried to run, scrambling backward on his hands and feet, but a mercenary stepped forward and slammed a rifle butt into his ribs. Tyler collapsed, wheezing. Miller didn't run. He didn't drop. He slowly lowered himself to a crouch behind a stack of oxygen tanks, his eyes narrowing. He watched them secure the room, zip-tying the crew's hands. He saw their insignia, a jagged trident. Corporate raiders. They were here for the core samples, billions of dollars in rare earth minerals sitting in the vault. But they had made a mistake. In their arrogance, they had ignored the old man in the greasy coveralls near the junction box. They saw a janitor. They didn't see the man who had survived the Kursk recovery operation. They didn't see the man who knew every bolt, every wire, and every fatal flaw of the station. The leader of the mercenaries ripped his mask off, revealing a scarred face. "If anyone moves," he smiled, "I open the external valves and let the ocean do the rest." Miller, hidden in the shadows of the machinery, gripped his heavy wrench. Not today, he thought. Miller stayed perfectly still, his breathing shallow and controlled. This was saturation diving 101. Conserve oxygen, lower the heart rate, observe the environment. While the mercenaries were busy shouting orders and hacking into the mainframe, Miller wasn't looking at them as people. He was looking at the station as a grid of potential energy. His eyes scanned the room, but he didn't see walls and ceilings. He saw schematics. Target A. High-voltage conduit running overhead. 480 volts. Three-phase industrial power. Unshielded at the junction point he had been repairing. If that cable snapped, it wouldn't just spark. It would turn the metal floor into an electric chair. Target B. The hydraulic lines powering the blast doors. Pressurized to 3,000 psi. If he severed the coupling, the fluid wouldn't just leak. It would jet out with enough force to cut through bone and Kevlar like a laser through butter. Target C. The oxygen enrichment valve. The station pumped extra O2 to keep the crew alert. If he bypassed the regulator and flooded the sector with pure oxygen, a single spark from his TIG welder would turn the air itself into a bomb. He looked at the mercenaries' gear. Electronic locks, night vision goggles, comms headsets. They were reliant on tech. They were reliant on the station behaving like a building. But Agir 9 wasn't a building. It was a pressurized bubble in a hostile void. Miller's internal monologue shifted into technical jargon. Load-bearing capacity on the gantry is reduced by rust corrosion. Thermal conductivity of the deck plating is high. If I superheat the manifold, the heat transfer will melt the soles of their boots before they even feel the temperature rise. He looked at Caden, who was sobbing on the floor. The kid was going to get himself killed. Miller needed to draw their fire. He needed to separate them. He shifted his weight, his hand finding the heavy portable arc welder strapped to his cart. It was an older model, heavy as a tombstone, but it had a modification Miller had made himself, a bypassed safety governor that allowed for a chaotic, high-amp discharge. He wasn't a soldier. He didn't know kung fu. But he was a master tradesman, and these intruders had just walked into his workshop. He calculated the distance to the main breaker. 20 feet. He calculated the sprint speed of his bad leg. Too slow. He needed a distraction. He looked at the steam release valve above the lead mercenary's head. Physics, Miller thought. It's the only law that matters down here. Miller moved with the silent grace of a predator, surprising for a man carrying 50 pounds of steel. He didn't go for the door. He went for the guts of the station. He slipped a heavy wrench into the flywheel of the ventilation intake. It jammed with a sickening crunch, causing the belt to squeal before snapping. The sudden noise drew the attention of the two rear guards. "Check that out," the leader barked. As they moved toward the noise, Miller was already gone. He had shimmied down into the subfloor maintenance crawlspace. It was a claustrophobic nightmare of pipes and cables, dripping with condensation and grease. To anyone else, it was a coffin. To Miller, it was home. He crawled toward the central power hub. He didn't want to kill the lights. That would trigger the emergency LEDs and give them clear shadows to hunt him. He wanted to weaponize the environment. He found the hydraulic pressure regulator for the sector. Pulling a pair of heavy-duty wire cutters from his belt, he didn't cut the line. Cutting it would depressurize the system. Instead, he located the relief valve, the safety mechanism designed to prevent explosions, and used his welder to fuse it shut. Then, he cranked the pressure pump to maximum. Above him, the pipes began to sing, a high-pitched whine that vibrated through the floorboards. The mercenaries looked around, confused. The station felt like it was waking up angry. Miller wasn't done. He located the fire suppression system. Agir 9 used a halon gas system to suck oxygen out of a room in case of fire. He rerouted the sensors, hot-wiring the trigger mechanism to a remote switch he fashioned from a spare solenoid. He was turning the very safety systems of the rig into traps. He could hear their boots clanging on the grate above his head. They were right on top of him. He saw dust falling through the grate as they walked. He held his breath. "It's nothing," a guard said above him. "Just old machinery breaking down." Miller smirked in the darkness. "Breaking down? No, son. I'm just revving the engine." He clipped a ground wire to the metal grating above. Now, the entire floor section was part of his circuit. He was treating the invasion like a complex welding job. Prep the surface, control the heat, and burn away the impurities. Miller burst from the floor, grating in the cargo bay like a demon from the deep. He didn't have a gun. He had the exosuit, a heavy lifting frame used for moving crates of ore. He had strapped himself into it in the shadows of the loading dock. It wasn't Iron Man armor. It was a roll cage with hydraulic claws, clumsy and slow, but terrifyingly strong. The first mercenary turned, raising his rifle. Contact. Rear. Miller didn't hesitate. He slammed the left control stick forward. The hydraulic arm of the exosuit swung out with the force of a wrecking ball. It caught the mercenary mid-turn, the heavy steel claw impacting the man's tactical vest. The mercenary didn't fly backward. He was simply swatted aside, crumpling against the bulkhead with the sound of breaking ribs. "Open fire!" the leader screamed. Bullets sparked off the thick industrial roll cage of the exosuit. Ping! Ping! Zip! The glass shield in front of Miller's face spiderwebbed but held. It was ballistic glass, rated for deep-sea pressure, which meant small arms fire was just an annoyance. Miller charged. The exosuit whirred and hissed. He wasn't trying to box them. He was trying to herd them. He drove the machine toward a stack of heavy steel pipes. He hit the release lever on the cargo straps. The pipes, weighing tons, cascaded down like a waterfall of steel. Two mercenaries dove out of the way, rolling across the floor. Miller used the distraction to grab a high-pressure water cannon, usually used for cleaning or, with the exosuit's claw. He squeezed the trigger. The jet of water, pressurized to remove barnacles from ship hulls, hit the third mercenary. It was like being hit by a solid wall. The man was lifted off his feet and pinned against the far wall, the water pressure holding him there, unable to move, unable to breathe. Flank him. Get behind the cage. Miller knew the exosuit was too slow for a sustained fight. The hydraulics were overheating, screaming in protest. He had bought time, created chaos, and taken out two of their numbers. But he was trapped. He saw the leader pulling a grenade from his belt. Miller slammed the eject button. The roll cage popped open. He rolled out, hitting the deck hard, his bad leg screaming in protest, just as the grenade rolled under the exosuit. Boom! The machine vanished in a fireball, shrapnel tearing through the air. Miller was already scrambling toward the heavy blast door of the wet dock. He slammed his hand on the locking mechanism, spinning the wheel. He was leaving the frying pan and jumping into the fire. The wet dock was a nightmare of shadows and dripping water. This was the moon pool, where the submersibles entered and exited the ocean. The water here was open to the sea below, a dark churning square of black liquid that smelled of salt and death. Miller limped behind a row of decompression tanks. He was bleeding from a cut on his forehead, the blood mixing with the grease on his face. He checked his pockets. A roll of duct tape, a flare, his welding torch, and a few wrench sockets. Not exactly an arsenal. The blast door he had just sealed shuddered. Clang. They were cutting through. He could see the glowing orange tip of a thermal lance slicing through the steel. They would be through in minutes. Miller looked at the environment. The wet dock was a maze of catwalks, hanging chains, and deep pools. It was humid, the air thick with the taste of brine. He retreated deeper into the room, climbing a ladder to the upper gantry. His bad leg dragged, catching on the rungs. The door gave way with a screech of tearing metal. The mercenaries poured in, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. Spread out, the leader hissed. He's wounded. He can't go far. Watch the water. Miller watched them from above. He was cornered. There was no way out except the ocean, and without a suit, the pressure would crush him into a meat cube in seconds. He was trapped in the siege. But the wet dock had a secret. It was designed to handle volatile gases released from the seabed. Miller crawled along the top of a massive yellow tank marked acetylene. He saw Caden and the other hostages being dragged in. The mercenaries were using them as human shields now. "Come out, old man," the leader shouted, pressing a gun to Caden's head. "Or the kid learns how to breathe water." Miller's heart hammered against his ribs. He couldn't attack them directly. There were too many, and they had the kids. He needed to change the battlefield. He looked at the fire sprinkler system above the mercenaries. It wasn't water in those pipes. In this sector it was a chemical foam retardant, highly conductive if mixed right. He looked at the main power coupling for the crane. He looked at the water below. The site was a maze, yes. But every maze has a solution. And Miller was about to rewrite the puzzle. Miller closed his eyes for a second, visualizing the chemistry. Acetylene. C2H2. Unstable. When mixed with oxygen, it burns at over 3,000 degrees Celsius. But he didn't want a fire. He wanted a concussive force. He wanted a pressure wave. He looked at the hyperbaric welding chamber sitting in the corner of the dock. It was a reinforced sphere used for dry welding pipeline sections. It was connected to the station's main oxygen and acetylene lines. If I bleed the acetylene into the chamber, Miller calculated, and mix it with pure oxygen at a ratio of 1 to 2.5, it wouldn't just burn. It would detonate with the force of an anti-tank mine. But he needed a delivery system. He couldn't just throw a match. He pulled the flare from his pocket. He stripped the magnesium striker off the cap. He crawled toward the intake valve of the hyperbaric chamber. Quietly, agonizingly slowly, he cracked the valve. The hiss was masked by the ambient noise of the ocean churning in the moon pool. He smelled the garlic-like odor of the gas filling the sphere. He needed to overpressurize it just enough so the metal hull of the chamber acted like shrapnel, but directional shrapnel. He used his wrench to loosen the bolts on the front hatch, the side facing the mercenaries. Physics, he thought again. PV equals nRT. Pressure times volume. He was creating a cannon. The chamber was the barrel. The hatch was the bullet. And the gas was the gunpowder. He needed a trigger. He took his portable welding unit, stripped the leads, and wrapped the copper wire around the magnesium striker. He ran the wire back to his hiding spot behind a concrete pillar. It was a crude, remote detonator. "Last chance, Miller," the leader screamed. "I'm counting to 3. Miller looked at the setup. It was desperate. It was reckless. It was the kind of engineering that got people fired or killed. But it was beautiful. 1. Miller wrapped the wire around his gloved hand. 2. He whispered the welder's prayer. "Hold the line. Keep the arc steady." 3. Miller touched the wire to the live battery of his drill. The world turned white. The hyperbaric chamber didn't just explode. It erupted. The mixture of acetylene and oxygen inside, ignited by the magnesium spark, created a shockwave that defied description. Because Miller had loosened the front bolts, the heavy steel hatch, weighing 300 pounds, was launched across the room like a cannonball. It tore through the air with a terrifying shriek. It missed the hostages by inches, exactly as Miller had calculated, and slammed into the group of mercenaries. The kinetic energy was massive. It pulverized the cover they were hiding behind, sending bodies and debris flying into the moon pool. The concussion knocked everyone flat. The sound was a physical blow, a thunderclap that ruptured eardrums and shattered the overhead lights. The wet dock plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the sputtering fires of the explosion. Then came the secondary effect. The blast had damaged the structural integrity of the walkway. The floor beneath the remaining mercenaries groaned and gave way. With a scream of twisting metal, the gantry collapsed, dumping the villains into the churning, freezing water of the moon pool below. Miller was ready. He knew the safe spot, the area behind the reinforced concrete pillar where the shockwave would be deflected. He rode out the tremors, dust raining down on his helmet. But the explosion had consequences. A high-pressure water pipe burst, spraying a jet of freezing seawater across the room. The station lurched. The breach alarm blared. Critical structural failure. Miller scrambled out from his cover. His ears were ringing, blood trickling from his nose. He saw Caden and the others, dazed but alive, huddled in the corner. "Get to the escape pods." Miller roared, his voice raspy from the smoke. "Go. Now. What about you?" Caden screamed, looking at the destruction. "I have to seal the breach," Miller shouted, pointing to the pipe he had intentionally damaged to create the chaos, which was now threatening to sink the whole rig. "If I don't patch this, the pressure drop kills us all." He grabbed his welding stinger. The water was rising around his ankles. The mercenaries were gone, washed away or broken, but now the ocean was the enemy. And the ocean never misses. The silence was heavier than the water. 6 hours later, the strobe lights of a U.S. Navy Deep Submergence Rescue Vehicle, DSRV, cut through the gloom of the Aegir 9's docking bay. A team of SEALs swept into the room, weapons raised, expecting a firefight. They found a tomb of twisted metal and scorched walls. They moved past the shattered remains of the mercenary squad, past the collapsed gantry. When they reached the wet dock, they lowered their weapons. The water level had risen to waist height, but it had stopped. The massive breach in the hull had been sealed. It was the ugliest weld the Navy Master Chief had ever seen. Thick, globby lines of metal layered over each other like scar tissue. But it held. It held back the entire Atlantic Ocean. And there, sitting on top of a crate, was Miller. He was soaked to the bone, his coveralls shredded. His welding mask sat on his lap. He was shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline crash and hypothermia. He was holding an unlit cigarette in his trembling fingers, just staring at the weld. Caden and the young crew, who had been rescued from the pods, rushed back in with the SEALs. They stopped when they saw him. "Clear," the lead SEAL said into his radio. "Site is secure. Hostiles neutralized." He looked at the makeshift cannon, the rewired sensors, the collapsed floor. He looked at Miller. Jesus. Who did all this? Demolitions expert. Caden stepped forward. He looked at the old man he had mocked that morning. He saw the burns on Miller's hands, the exhaustion in his eyes, and the sheer impossibility of what he had done. "No," Caden said, his voice filled with a newfound reverence. "He's a welder." Miller looked up, cracked a tired smile, and pointed to the weld. "Ugly as sin," he rasped. "But she'll hold till Tuesday." The SEALs stood in awe. They knew warfare. But this was industrial wizardry. This was blue-collar genius. 2 weeks later, the Aegir 9 was back in dry dock for repairs. The story had gone global. The welder of the deep. The company offered Miller a massive bonus, a promotion, a desk job with a view. Miller turned it all down. He stood by the chain-link fence of the shipyard, his old canvas bag over his shoulder. He was wearing clean civilian clothes, but he still walked with that same stiff limp. Caden and Tyler ran up to the gate just as Miller was scanning his badge to leave for the last time. "You're really leaving?" Tyler asked, breathless. "You could run this place, Miller." Miller adjusted his cap. "I fix things, kid. I don't run them. Besides," he tapped his bad leg, "my knees don't like the stairs in the corner office." Caden held out a hand. "Thank you. For everything. We thought you were just a janitor." Miller finished for him. "No," Caden said firmly. "The hardest man on the rig." Miller took the hand. His grip was iron. "Listen to the machine, Caden. It talks to you. If you respect it, it saves your life. If you mock it, it buries you." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the gray fog of the early morning. He left behind a station that was still standing solely because of his hands. Inside the station, on the main wall of the locker room, someone had welded a permanent plaque into the steel. It didn't have a corporate logo or a safety slogan. It just had a crude drawing of a welding torch and 3 words burned into the metal. Miller was here. And for every young engineer who walked past it, that was warning and inspiration enough. The legend of the blue-collar genius had just begun.